Imagine living inside the most magnificent palace in the world. Thousands of servants surround you. Gold covers the buildings. Silk hangs from the walls. Food is prepared for you every day. And yet, you cannot choose whom you love. You cannot simply leave. You cannot build an ordinary family. And for many people inside the imperial palace, you might spend years surrounded by people, while still being completely alone. This was the strange world of the Chinese imperial palace. And inside that world, something unexpected happened. Eunuchs and palace women sometimes formed private relationships that could resemble marriage. The Chinese called one form of this relationship Duishi, or eating together. And during the Ming Dynasty, another term became especially associated with long-term partnerships between palace women and eunuchs, Caihu. To modern ears, these words sound almost harmless. But behind them was a hidden world of affection, loneliness, jealousy, companionship, money, and sometimes heartbreak. So what exactly was Duishi? Were eunuchs and palace women really married? And perhaps most importantly, why did the imperial palace allow such relationships to exist at all? The story begins much earlier than the Ming Dynasty. The term Duishi already appears in historical records from the Han Dynasty, more than 1,000 years before the Ming Palace. But there is an important detail that is often forgotten. In its earliest recorded usage, Duishi did not necessarily mean a eunuch and a palace woman. The Han historical record describes palace women forming such relationships with one another. A commentary by the scholar Yin Shirgu explained the expression as palace women treating one another almost like husbands and wives. In other words, the original meaning of Duishi was broader than the popular modern image. It referred to a form of private companionship inside the palace. Over the centuries, the meaning gradually expanded, and eventually, the term became strongly associated with relationships between palace women and eunuchs. Why eunuchs? Because the imperial palace was an extraordinary social environment. A palace woman might enter the imperial household as a teenager. Once inside, her freedom was severely restricted. She could not simply meet a man from outside. She could not choose an ordinary husband. And depending on the dynasty and the circumstances, she might remain inside the palace for years. For a young woman surrounded by hundreds or thousands of other people, the palace could therefore become a place of profound loneliness. Eunuchs lived under a different kind of restriction. They served inside the palace precisely because their bodies had been altered to prevent them from becoming ordinary members of the imperial household. Many could not establish a conventional family. They could not simply leave the palace and build a normal life. So the palace contained two large groups of people who had been separated from ordinary family life. And they lived in close proximity. They worked together. They talked. They ate. They exchanged information. They helped each other. And sometimes, they became emotionally attached. This does not mean every relationship was romantic. Some may have been little more than companionship. Some were probably practical arrangements. Some may have involved money or protection. And some may genuinely have involved affection. The historical evidence does not allow us to turn every case into a love story. But by the late Ming Dynasty, the evidence becomes much more interesting. A new term appears again and again. Caihu. Literally, the word does not sound romantic at all. But inside the Ming Palace, it could refer to a eunuch who became the long-term companion of a palace woman. Historical accounts describe these relationships as much more stable than simple companionship. The two might exchange possessions. They might treat each other like husband and wife. And sometimes the relationship was regarded as a lifelong partnership. One Ming source described palace women choosing eunuchs as their companions and referred to these relationships as Caihu. Another contemporary writer, Shun Difu, recorded something even more remarkable. By the late Ming period, he wrote, "Palace women with companions were no longer unusual. In fact, he suggested that the practice had become increasingly common over several decades. The relationships could involve promises of loyalty. People could arrange them through intermediaries. Some could even make private vows to remain together. And once two people had formed such a relationship, jealousy could become very real." Shin Difu recorded the story of a palace woman named Wu Zanu. She had been associated with a eunuch named Song Bao. But later, she became involved with another eunuch, Zhongxian. Song Bao was devastated. According to the account, he eventually left the palace world and became a Buddhist monk. Whether every detail of the story should be accepted literally is impossible to know. But the story is important for another reason. It shows how Ming observers themselves understood these relationships. They were not necessarily treating them as meaningless arrangements. They could involve attachment. They could involve jealousy. They could involve betrayal. And they could cause genuine emotional pain. In other words, inside the Forbidden City, people who were officially denied ordinary family life had created something that sometimes looked remarkably like it. But these relationships were not necessarily accepted by the imperial government. In fact, some emperors tried very hard to stop them. The Hongwu Emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang, the founder of the Ming Dynasty, was famously strict about palace eunuchs. According to Shun Difu, eunuchs who violated the rules concerning marriage could face extremely severe punishment. The emperor wanted the palace hierarchy to remain under control. He wanted eunuchs to remain servants. He wanted palace women to remain within the imperial system. And he certainly did not want private relationships developing inside a place designed to be controlled from top to bottom. But there was a problem. People continued to form these relationships. Rules could forbid them. Punishments could threaten them. But loneliness was not so easy to eliminate. By the middle and late Ming period, the practice had become much harder to suppress. And there is an extraordinary detail in the historical accounts. Some palace women who did not have such a companion could even be mocked by other women. In other words, what had once been forbidden could gradually become almost normal. The palace had created the conditions for the behavior it was trying to prevent. And that contradiction tells us something important about life inside the imperial court. The Forbidden City was not only a place of emperors, concubines, ceremonies, and political intrigue. It was also a workplace. A gigantic one. Thousands of people lived and worked there. They got sick. They became lonely. They formed friendships. They argued. They fell in love. They became jealous. They lost people they cared about. And they tried to create small pieces of ordinary life inside an extraordinary institution. This is why Duishi should not simply be translated as fake marriage. That phrase makes the relationship sound like a joke. The reality was more complicated. For some people, it may have been temporary. For others, it may have been deeply meaningful. Some relationships were practical. Some were emotional. Some may have been exploitative. And some may have resembled genuine marriage as closely as the palace system allowed. There was another important difference between the words Duishi and Caihu. Duishi could describe a broader form of companionship inside the palace. Caihu, especially in late Ming descriptions, was more closely associated with a stable relationship between a palace woman and a eunuch. So if Duishi could mean, we belong together, then Caihu could sometimes mean something closer to, we are a couple. And this hidden world produced some extraordinary stories. One of the most famous involves a woman who was not actually an ordinary palace maid. Her name was Kushi. She was the wet nurse of the future Tianqi emperor. And she became connected to one of the most powerful eunuchs in Chinese history, Zhongxian. The relationship between them was far from an ordinary palace romance. Historical records say that Kushi had previously been associated with another eunuch, Wei Chao. Later, Zhongxian entered the picture. The two became extremely close. And when the young emperor ascended the throne, Zhongxian and Kushi together became enormously powerful. Zhongxian eventually became the most powerful eunuch in the Ming court. Kushi was granted an extraordinary status. Together, they controlled access to the emperor and accumulated enormous political influence. Their story is a reminder that relationships inside the palace could sometimes have consequences far beyond private life. A private alliance could become a political alliance. A personal connection could become a source of power. But it is also important not to mistake their story for the typical experience of ordinary palace women and eunuchs. Kushi was a royal wet nurse. Zhongxian was a powerful eunuch official. Their relationship existed within a completely different political environment. Most palace couples had nothing like their power. For an ordinary palace woman, the reality was much simpler. She was trapped inside an institution she had not designed. And the eunuch beside her was trapped there too. Their relationship could not give them freedom. It could not turn them into an ordinary married couple. It could not give them children. And it could not erase the hierarchy surrounding them. But perhaps it could give them something else. Someone to talk to. Someone who remembered them. Someone who would notice if they were gone. Someone who might sit beside them at the end of a long day. And perhaps, for a person living inside a palace filled with thousands of strangers, that was already enormously important. This is also why the history of Duishi should not be reduced to a story about sex. The surviving records are much more interested in relationships, loyalty, money, jealousy, conflict, and companionship. The palace was designed to control bodies, but it could not completely control emotions. And that may be the most fascinating part of the story. The imperial government could regulate who entered the palace. It could regulate where people worked. It could regulate who had access to the emperor. It could punish forbidden relationships, but it could not completely prevent human beings from becoming attached to one another. The palace created isolation. People responded by creating companionship. The palace tried to suppress private families. People created relationships that sometimes resembled families. And the more strictly the institution tried to control ordinary life, the more unusual forms of ordinary life appeared inside it. There is also one final misconception worth clearing up. The popular image of Duishi often makes it sound as if every eunuch and palace woman automatically became a couple. That was certainly not the case. The historical evidence is scattered. Different dynasties had different palace systems. Different eunuchs had different physical conditions. Different palace women had different circumstances. And the meaning of Duishi itself changed over time. The evidence is especially strong for the existence of such relationships in the Ming Palace, particularly during the late Ming period. For the Qing dynasty, the situation was different, partly because the system governing palace women changed. So we should be careful about taking stories from the Ming Palace and presenting them as universal rules for every Chinese dynasty. History is rarely that simple. What we can say with confidence is that these relationships existed. They were known to people inside the palace. They were sometimes forbidden. They were sometimes tolerated. And in the late Ming period, they could become surprisingly open and socially recognizable. The strangest part is perhaps not that eunuchs and palace women formed relationships. The strangest part is that the imperial palace created an environment in which such relationships became almost inevitable. Thousands of human beings were placed behind walls. They were separated from normal society. They were denied ordinary family life. And then the rulers were surprised when those human beings tried to create emotional lives of their own. The Forbidden City was built to separate the emperor from the outside world. But behind those enormous red walls, ordinary human emotions survived. People wanted companionship. They wanted loyalty. They wanted someone who cared about them. And sometimes, a eunuch and a palace woman found that person in each other. They could not have a normal marriage. They could not build an ordinary family. They could not escape the palace. But they could sit together. They could share food. They could exchange gifts. They could wait for each other. They could become jealous. They could grieve. And in some cases, they could remain together for the rest of their lives. That is the strange history hidden behind two simple Chinese words, Duishi and Caihu. Not simply a story about eunuchs. Not simply a story about palace women. But a story about what happens when an empire tries to control every part of human life and discovers that it cannot control the human need for companionship.